Okay, yeah, go ahead. Record to the cloud. Thank you.
All right. So hello, everybody. Before I get started, and before I share the screen and we talk about everything, I'm just going to let you know that yesterday I presented from 8:30 in the morning until 9:30 at night at UberConf. And so if my voice cracks, if it goes away completely, if I just decide to take a nap in the middle of the session, I hope you'll forgive me. Yeah, I actually gave pretty much two full days of presentations at UberConf. And then as if that wasn't enough, I agreed to play some board games after hours last night. And Rohit was there and he played with us for a while and then he left. And so we kicked him out of the game and just kept playing without him. But yeah, so yeah, it was a tiring event, but happy to be here. And I just hope I can pull it together while we're here. If I have to stop for a minute and kind of collect myself, that's why. So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen. I hope everybody can see it now. I'm going to move a few things around because Zoom likes to put everything that Zoom does right in my way. There we go. I'll just move that over there. And I think I'm okay. All right, cool. All right. So yeah, this is it's a presentation on something that I don't like to actually directly talk about, but I'll go ahead and tell you why. I don't like the phrase best practices because in my experience, the words best practices have come to mean do this or you're an idiot type stuff. And that's not what I'm trying to tell you here. That's why I tried to avoid the phrase best practices here. So I came up with a slightly clever title, Put Your Best Boot Forward. And what this is more, guidelines, tips, suggestions, things that I find valuable. And so that's what we're going to talk about. This is who I am. This is where you can follow me on Twitter, and this is where you can email me. Of course, the best time to ask a question is when you have it. So if you were to, I guess, post those in the chat, they'll be collected and put forward to me as we go. I'm not going to really monitor the chat myself that much, but others will, and they will relay those to me. But again, if you don't get your question in while we're here, if you don't even think about it until after this is long over, by all means, feel free to email me and I will do my best to get back to you. I won't promise a timely response, but I will promise that I'll eventually reply to you. And with that said, I got to figure out why my slides aren't moving. There we go. They're going to have very few slides, very few, and more code. And the reason I do that is because it's more fun. I'm able to try out new things. And one of the things especially if we were live, and we can still kind of do it here, but it's a little bit easier to do when we're in person. But I can even try to take requests to some degree. If somebody asks a question that I wasn't planning on covering and I stop and think about it for a moment and realize that maybe I could cover it, then I'll throw something in. And I can't really do that. Nobody wants to watch me put together slides to cover some new topic. So, but if I'm doing some live coding, we can do that. Now, the downside of doing live coding is that mistakes will be made. And I've gone ahead and made 2 mistakes on this slide just to get that out of the way. And so we'll have more. That's my promise. I will make more mistakes. And I can assure you that we won't finish. And what I mean by that is that when I put together this talk last year, I sat down and I wrote down a list of all the things I could possibly talk about. And there were like 50 items or more on that list. And I decided there's no way that's going to happen. Not in an hour and a half. There's no way. And so I started trimming it down to just a handful. And that was great until the beginning of this year. And when I gave this presentation for the very first time. And right as I was entering the room, I started thinking of a couple of things to move up from the cutting floor and move them into the main list. And over time, I keep adding new things and then I trim it back down. And it doesn't matter what I do. I've never finished. I gave this presentation yesterday at UberConf and I didn't finish. I haven't finished before. I'm not going to do that now. And that's okay. We're going to move through certain topics and see what we can do. And after about an hour and a half or so, I'll just stop. Wherever we're at, we'll just stop and that'll be okay. All right. Again, just tips, just tricks, just suggestions as they say as Captain Barbosa said in the Pirates of the Caribbean movie about the pirate code, it's really more what you call guidelines than actual rules. So we're going to If you don't like this, if it helps you get your job done, great, use it. If it doesn't, just completely disregard it. Hopefully there'll be something in here you can use, but if you don't like what I'm about to show you, that's fine too. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with this, and I do encounter this, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but with a group as big as I see in the chat, there's always going to be some, at least some, who don't know a lot about what Spring Boot is. So let's give a little bit of a background before we get into the main topic. And Spring Boot has been around for, well, since 2014. And I was actually not so much part of the development of it, but I contributed to it in the sense that me and some other folks were working on a couple of different projects, one of which was the Spring Frameworks website. And we were using Spring Boot as, or sorry, our website was acting as a kind of a driver and an example application to drive the development of Spring Boot. So I've been around with Spring Boot for quite a while, before it was even 1.0. And I've been working with Spring Framework pretty much since it was 0.9. And that was just over 18 years ago when Spring Framework was first released. And the thing about Spring Framework is it's been around, like I said, a little over 18 years. And it initially set out to greatly simplify enterprise Java development. And at that time, what that meant was finding more palatable alternatives to things like EJB2 and struts and things like that. And it did a great job of doing that. And over time, Spring Framework has continued, and the Spring ecosystem has continued to evolve and to grow and to continue to solve additional problems. I mean, things like, you know, declarative security and declarative caching were some of the early entries in that. And more recently, we have things like reactive programming and microservices and whatnot. So Spring itself has, and the ecosystem around it have continued to solve and simplify Java development. But when Spring Framework first came about, it did that at the cost of developers having to write lots of XML, lots of it. And so Spring Framework learned from that. It evolved, it got better, it gave us less XML to achieve the same thing. And then over time, we got things like component scanning and auto wiring so that Spring could just discover your components instead of explicitly configuring them. And then somewhere around, I can't remember exactly what version of Spring it was, but somewhere around the Spring 4.0 time period, it may have been 4.0, the Spring introduced this concept of conditional beans. And there's always been something, you know, there's always been a form of conditional beans for quite some while with something called profiles, but conditional beans was really something different. It gave us the ability to based on some condition, some factor, something that basically returns a Boolean. If that condition is met, then certain components in your application will get created. And if the condition is not met, then they will not be created. And Spring Boot ran with that. Spring Boot took that and made it where any component that your application needs that's common, that's basic, that's foundational, you don't have to configure it yourself. If you're building a web application, if I were to ask everyone here to go without Spring Boot, but with just the Spring Framework to go build a web application, and just Hello World, just something as simple as Hello World in a web app, everybody here would have to do a certain amount of baseline stuff like configure the dispatcher servlet in web.xml, can enable Spring MVC, make sure that you have a build, make sure you have a container to put this in, and then at some point you actually get to write the controller that's going to handle these requests. Well, the premise of auto configuration, is automatically configuring components. The whole idea here is if everybody has to do it, then why does everybody have to do it? That's what frameworks are for, is to not make you configure things yourself, but if everybody has to do something, then why does everybody have to do it? And so Spring Boot auto configuration will detect that, in fact, the conditions are met that make it look like you're building a web application, and it will configure all the components for you that are foundational. The only thing that you have to do is write the domain specific controllers, because it doesn't know what you're trying to do with your controllers. It can't anticipate that. And so that's the web case, but it applies in so many other ways, like persistence and caching and and to some degree security and some other things as well. Spring Boot will automatically configure the components you need based on what it sees, specifically in the class path. If certain components are in the class path, then if Spring MVC is in your class path, why would it be there if you weren't building a web app with it? So it'll automatically configure that for you. It also provides you simplified build dependencies. And this comes down to these things called starter dependencies that you add to your build. And those dependencies themselves usually do not have any Java code behind them, any classes behind them. Instead, they just transitively depend on other components. And so, for example, if you're wanting to build a web application, you might need something like the Servlet API. You might need Spring MVC. You might need, if you're building like a REST API, you might need Jackson to do some JSON processing. And rather than force you to add all these dependencies to your build yourself and manage the versions and whatnot, Spring Boot starter dependencies just say, hey, add the web starter to your build. And transitively, we'll pull in these other components for you. And if you're persisting to a Mongo database, we'll add the Mongo starter to your data, to your build, and it'll transitively pull in all the components necessary to enable you to work with Mongo. That way you don't have to worry about individual dependencies and individual versions of dependencies. And then finally, there's this thing called the actuator. And the actuator gives you insight into what's going on in the internals of an application as it's running. It allows you to see all sorts of things, like what properties are available to your components in the form of what does the environment look like. You can see what logging levels are set at different package levels. You can see how certain web requests are mapped to your controllers. You can see metrics. There's a lot of things you can do with this. And in this session, I'm going to show you, indirectly, in most cases, little bits of all this. This is not a getting started with Spring Boot type of talk, but there are going to be some getting started things you're going to see along the way. And at some point, we're going to touch on each one of these three things, as well as some other stuff that Spring Boot offers. But these are the three main things that it offers. And so with that, before we go any further, I'm going to say, well, let's write some code. But first, is there any questions before we move forward? And I'm looking over at the chat, and I see that someone has asked, can I see your list of 50 items? No, I'm not even sure I want to share that with anybody. It's all scratch, but maybe I could, but no, I don't think I'm going to do that. And then I also see the question, if Spring pulls in jars and my Palm pulls in some jars, or the same jars, how are the versions controlled? Well, ultimately, the answer to that is, well, ideally, your project would not pull in those same jars. You just rely on what Spring pulls in. However, I suppose if they are both in that build, it kind of, and you say Palm, so you're specifically talking about Maven, but whether it's Maven or Gradle, they each have their rules on who wins. And I can't remember because I always get these confused, but one of them is the closest version first, and the other one is the newest version first. And so it just kind of, it's just handled by the build, not so much. Spring doesn't make that decision. However, what you can do is, and I'll show you a little bit about this. I'll at least allude to it in a moment. You can, if you disagree with what Spring has specified as the version you want, you can override that if you disagree. Usually you're better off just trusting it and letting it happen, but if you want to override it, you can. There's times when you might want to override it. For example, if there's a security CVE fix in a newer version and Spring hasn't picked that up yet, then yeah, you can override it. It's pretty easy to do so. All right. Yeah, and correct, it does depend on the build tool. And to some degree, I think it even depends a little bit, not just on the tool itself, but on certain plugins in the builds, because I've seen plugins in different, like in Gradle, that will actually change Gradle's default rules. So it kind of depends. All right, and also,
Craig, I have a question.
Sure.
Are there multiple vendors that supplies more, enterprise Spring Boot, and is there anything that sort?
Yes, but I'm not sure I can talk about them.
Okay.
But yeah, there are others out there who are supporting the boot ecosystem with their own starters and libraries and stuff. I'm aware of one in particular because I work with them quite frequently, but I'm not sure if I'm supposed to talk about them. So,
Understand. All right. Thank you.
I mean, I'm probably okay, but I'm not going to take that chance.
Yep.
All right. Anything else? All right. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to write some code. But first, I want to close my slides because I have only one more slide. And so you'll excuse me for doing something a little early in the presentation, but it's just because I want to close my slides. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the session. Check out my books. They make great gifts. Spring in Action, the 6th edition, and Build Talking Apps for Alexa. Both of those, I don't recommend anybody ever do this, but I wrote those concurrently. Don't ever do that. That's insane to write 2 books at the same time. But they came out at more or less the same time, and they're both available in print, so check them out. And if you have any, questions, especially about the one on the right, which I'm not talking about tonight, yeah, just feel free to email me. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. But with that said, let's close the slides. Let's get rid of those, get those out of the way. And I'm going to pull my IDE over. And I'm going to, as necessary, I've made the font in the editor pretty big, so hopefully everybody can see it. The one thing I can't easily do with Eclipse, I'm using Spring Tool Suite, which is a set of plugins on top of Eclipse. One of the things I can't very easily do is change the fonts of this right there, or this left-hand side menu and tree, the package explorer. It's possible, but it's a pain in the butt. So I apologize for that. If possible, I could zoom in, but I don't think the zooming in translates to Zoom very well. So, which is ironic when you think about it, that I can't zoom in on Zoom, but I'll do my best. And we're going to create a brand new project. And this is how you would create any new starter project. You say create new Spring Starter project. Notice at the top here, it says start.spring.io. Now the reason I call that out is if you want to, you can do this. Let me pull over a browser. And you can go to start.spring.io. And what you're going to have here is a website where you can answer some questions about your project, what you want to build with, what language you want to build with, what version you want to build with, and whatnot. You can add some dependencies to it. Maybe you want to build a web app, so you add that dependency. Maybe you add some others, and then you can generate a zip file. You can unzip that zip file, load up the directory in your IDE, and go to work. The good news is you don't have to do that. And you can do that pretty much indirectly using these wizards in Spring Tool Suite. You can do this in IntelliJ. IntelliJ has really great Spring support as well. You can do this in VS Code. You can do this in NetBeans. Pretty much every modern IDE for Java that you might consider using will have some form of this to enable you to go out to start.spring.io and build your project. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to call this AnyJug demo. That's going to be the name of my project. And I'm going to use Maven. I have no problems with Gradle. I like Gradle just fine. I like Gradle just fine, but I'm going to stick with Maven for a couple of reasons, most of which is I feel comfortable doing that in front of people. I don't feel comfortable doing Gradle in front of people. I'm more likely to make mistakes. Jar, you got your choices of jar versus war. Jar is the default because in 2022, more and more projects are heading toward the cloud and not toward a traditional application server. And so building an executable jar is more common these days. However, if that's not for you, if that's not the situation for you, we understand. You can also pick the WAR file format. Honestly, the resulting project is virtually no different. There is one additional class if you choose WAR, and it's essentially a Java equivalent of a web.xml file. And the build file has one character that's different, but I'm going to leave it up to you to try to guess what that one character might be. You have your choice of Java version, and it defaults currently to Java 17, but you can still go back to 8 or 11 or forward to 18. But I'm going to stick with 17. That's where I feel most comfortable these days. And you have your choice of languages. You can have Java, Kotlin, or Groovy. But the truth of the matter is, this could be any language. This could be any language that runs on the JVM. It could be Scala. It could be JRuby. It could even be Clojure. And yes, I have seen people develop Spring Boot apps in Clojure. It is the weirdest thing ever. And if you want to know how to do that, please don't ask me, because I don't get it, but it can be done. But I'm going to stick with Java because this is not a talk on how to use Kotlin with Spring. That's a great talk. I have given that talk before, but we're not doing that tonight. Instead, I'm going to just stick with Java, and we'll move forward with that. Now, these are just questions that if you've ever worked with Maven, you might recognize. These are fields that go into a POM file. I'm not going to change any of these. I'm just going to kind of leave them alone, but I am going to change my default package because I just kind of like a nice short package, especially for demos. And then we get over here and we get to pick our Spring Boot version. It always defaults to the latest GA, which is right now 2.7.1. You can always go back to the most previous GA. You can go back to the previous GA's next snapshot. You can go to the current GA's next snapshot. Plus, you get milestones and whatnot. These are all great choices to have here, and you might have reasons for picking those. But I'm always going to stick with this one. It's the one that makes me feel most likely to succeed tonight. If you don't like that, if you for some reason you feel the need to pick a different version, you can still do that's not listed on there. You can still do that. You would just have to go manually edit your build after once the project has been created. And then I'm going to start off simply with two dependencies. I'm going to start off with Spring Web, because I'm going to build a small REST API to start with. And I'm going to start off with a thing called DevTools. Now, this is really not on my list of things to talk about tonight, but it's worth mentioning DevTools. If you haven't seen it already, it's a really good thing to have. You almost want to have it just selected as a default and make it there all the time, because what DevTools is going to do is it's going to enable you to do a lot of different things. There's a lot of different things it helps with, but one of the main things it helps with is if I ever make a change to a class file and I hit save, it'll automatically restart my app for me. And so I don't have to, save and then hit a button to refresh it, because even though hitting a button to get my application to restart isn't that much effort, I'm a lazy programmer, and even hitting a button is sometimes a little too much work. And then I say finish. And once it starts up, once it's resolved, we're going to see, oh, that was actually fast. I've been at a conference at a hotel using Hotel Network for the last couple of days. And for this project to have resolved and been downloaded and made available to me as quickly as it did was a little shocking to me. I'm at home where I have good internet, so it's kind of nice. But okay, I'm going to do something very, very simple here and kind of stupid, really. I'm going to create a REST API, but it's not going to be a good REST API. It's going to be a flaky API. It's going to fail. In fact, it's not going to work. I'm going to purposefully make it fail. So I'm going to annotate for those of you who may not have actually worked with Spring MVC before, this is how you create a REST controller, is you annotate the class with REST controller. You can create as many methods as you want to handle different requests, but I'm going to create just one for now. Get mapping /flaky. And it's going to return a string, nothing fancy. We're going to keep it fairly simple for now. And what this is going to return is going to be dependent on whether everything works or not. So if it works, if in the happy case, it's going to say it worked. But if it does, in the unhappy case, and that'll be determined by a random number. Now, I am absolutely not recommending you write this code and put this in production. That's a bad idea. But for demo purposes, it's going to help me demonstrate something in a moment. So if that random number is less than 0.5, then throw a new flaky exception. And I'm going to pass it a message that says the value was too low, and it'll have the random value in it. Okay, so now I just need a flaky exception. We'll let the IDE create one of those for us, and I'll need the constructor. So here's the message. Super message. And the only other thing, I don't have to do this, but usually makes people happy if I at least do that to get rid of the warning. Okay, so there. Let's go back to my controller and see what I did wrong here. So throw new flaky exception. Well, it's a checked exception. So I either have to throw it here or I have to do something else. I'm going to do this. Actually, I really don't like checked exceptions that much. I'm going to change this to a runtime exception. And there, I feel better. All right, everybody's happy. Let's test this out. Before we do anything else, let's test this out. Just make sure it's doing something useful. I do need to do this. I have learned from experience that if I don't do what I'm about to do, at some point during a presentation, things start going really weird and I have to restart my IDE. So I'm going to do this. Okay, we should be good now. All right, so I'm going to bring over a window. I'm going to use curl localhost 8080/flaky. Anybody want to place bets on whether this is going to actually work or not work? Let's see. Oh, it failed. And that's on purpose. I mean, if you look up here, you can see that it was the flaky exception that was thrown because 0.10, whether that 0.109429, whatever, that is a much lower number than 0.5. So it did fail. Of course, if I tried it again a couple of times, it's going to keep failing, but then it works. So at least in theory, 50% of the time it's going to pass and 50% of the time it's going to fail. Well, now that we've written this, let's consider what we're looking at here. Here's this nice stack trace. It's pretty long. It's a little hard to read, but my gosh, this is exactly the kind of error you want to give back to a client, right? No, it's a horrible idea. Let's not do that. Let's make it nicer. And we're going to do a couple things with it. I'm going to move this out of the way. We'll bring it back when we're ready. I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to create something called a standard error. You can call it whatever you want if you're creating something like this, but it's a really good idea to have some sort of standardized response when things go bad. And so I'm going to have this thing defined as maybe taking some sort of code. It's going to maybe take a message, and then maybe it's going to have a recommended resolution. Now you can always, in a real app, in a real API, you can add whatever fields you want, and you could even create maybe several different types of errors that maybe all are based on standard error that have additional information depending on what kinds of errors you're dealing with. But for now, this is going to be just fine. So I'm going to put that in there, and just because for reasons of serialization, I'm going to have a default constructor, but I'm also going to have a convenience constructor that I can use when I need to create one of these. So I'm going to say int code, string message, string recommended resolution, and then we're just going to assign all those things. It's kind of a ugly amount of scrolling I had to do, but it's not a big deal. We're not going to look at it that long. Okay, good to go. Now let's come over here to our controller. What could we do here to return a standard error if this goes wrong? Well, we can't do much here because this returns a string. So we can't just say, oh, well, if that happens, then do that. We can't put a try catch block around it and say that happens. But what we can do is we can come down here and say exception handler. And we're interested in it handling the flaky exception. And we want that to return a standard error. You'll excuse the noise in the background. My dogs have decided to go ballistic. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but if you can, I apologize. So I'm going to take in our flaky exception, and I'm going to say return new standard error. And I'm going to pass in maybe some fake code of some sort, my message, and then maybe a recommended resolution of don't pick low numbers. I mean, it's a stupid answer, but it gets the job done. All right, now let's let DevTools restart things, which it just did, and let's see what happens. Let's pull my window back over. And it worked that time, so that wasn't our flaky exception, but it failed that time. And you can see that was a much nicer response, much nicer response. So now an API client making a request to our API knows that when it gets this error, it can parse this body and maybe get some information that's useful to it. Something it could put in an error message, maybe something it could put in some log files, maybe something that in the case of whatever the error code is that it can use to even decide how it might want to resolve this. But let's look at it a little bit differently. Well, before we do that, yeah, we'll do it here. Let's look at it here. If you look at this, everything's great, right? I mean, you got an error, it's all wonderful, except for one little thing. We're lying. We're telling our client everything's okay, and then we're giving him an error message. That's horrible. Don't ever do that. I've worked with an API or two in my time where I was writing the client code for it, and they did this. They would give me a HTTP 200 response and then give me an error, which leaves it up to me to go figure out what went wrong. And just don't do that. Please don't do that to people. Instead, you should return a meaningful HTTP status code. And because that status code, that status that's on the response, that should be their first clue that something went wrong. And yet it's not telling them that anything went wrong. You should always have useful status codes. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to come over here to our flaky exception. And on this, we're going to say response status. And here we get to pick what kind of status code we want. And there's a whole world of HTTP status codes we can choose from. And I really don't know what the right answer for this is. I haven't really sat and thought long about what flaky exception and how it maps to a particular status code that we have in this list here. So I'm just going to pick one that I like. I'm going to pick I am a teapot. That's the one I'm going to go with. And so now when we do this, you're going to see, well, once it's restarted anyway. Oh, you know what? I just realized what I did. I did something stupid. Remember I told you at the beginning of the talk I was going to make mistakes? Well, there's one of them. I put that in the wrong spot. I meant to put it right down here. So response status is an annotation that belongs on handlers, either request handlers or in this case, exception handlers. And I just wasn't paying attention and put it in the wrong spot. All right, so that time it worked, that time it worked, and that time it didn't work. And now we have the HTTP 418, which is the official status code for I am a teapot. Cool. Well, that's great, except for one little thing. What if we have other controllers in our API? No, we don't, but let's just pretend we did. We have other controllers in our API that also might throw a flaky exception or whatever kind of exception it is that we're dealing with. Are we going to have to take these lines 22 through 26, and duplicate them in all of the controllers? No, here's a better idea. Let's create a flaky exception controller advice. And in flaky exception controller advice, I'm going to start off by just copying this and taking it out of there, placing it here. And then all I'm going to do is annotate this as REST controller advice. We're going to let this restart. Notice I did take it out of flaky controller and I did hit save, so it's gone. And I'm going to do this again. And notice it still works. And now if I add another controller or 20 more controllers or 100 more controllers, it doesn't matter, and any of them throw a flaky exception, it's still going to handle it the way I wanted it to, with a status code of I am a teapot and with a standard error. Pretty cool. Any questions? All right, so I'm going to consult with my cheat sheet because I do have a cheat sheet to remind me what I'm going to cover tonight. And we've done those two things. Awesome.
Yeah, just a reminder, anyone has questions, please post them in the chat. We'll read out to Craig whenever you want to pause for that.
Sure. All right. Before I do the next thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about working with data in Spring. And Spring from the very beginning has had some great options for working with data persistence, including in the early days, things like, I'm blanking on the name of the stuff now, but certainly Hibernate. And in the early days of Spring, there was a class called Hibernate template. It was a template pattern-based class that gave you the ability to persist data through Hibernate. It turned out that Hibernate template, and then shortly after they had a similar class called JPA template. It turns out that for reasons I don't want to go into, and quite honestly, I'm not sure I even remember the details of it. Those Hibernate template and JPA template were bad ideas. They were kind of an anti-pattern in how they were implemented and how they worked. And so they went away. But nevertheless, the idea was good, that, you know, making it a little bit easier to work with data persistence through Hibernate or JPA. And then there was, and there still is a JPA template. I'm not sorry, a JDBC template. And so if you want to persist data to a relational database, then you can do that using JDBC template. And it's actually fairly easy to write your own repositories to persist whatever type of data you want, and just inject those repositories with a JDBC template and apply the right queries and inserts and updates and whatnot. Even outside of the core framework, Spring Data has several template options, including templates for working with Mongo document databases, or Neo4j graph databases, or Redis. If you want to use key value store databases like Redis, you can do that. There's template options for those. And you can build your own repositories that use those to get the job done. However, I don't particularly care for those if I can avoid them. There's times when they are the right thing to do, but generally speaking, if you're just doing some, you know, standard persistence, then why would you build your own repository? Instead, let me show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off by creating my domain. And I always do this example. I love this example so much that I do it every time I give a presentation. I'm going to create a book. I'm going to give that book an ID of type long. I'm going to give it an ISBN of type string. I'm going to give it a title, also of type string. And finally, I'm going to give it an author, which represents the author's first and last name. In a richer application, I might have a separate object that I'm working with that's not just the name of the author. It might be some, you know, another object that we're referencing with a foreign key or something like that. But for this example, I'm going to keep it fairly flat, and we're going to have author. And now I'm going to do this. And by the way, while I'm doing this, I'm going to avoid mentioning this too many times, because it sometimes upsets people if I do, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to mention it at least once. Is all this getters and setters that I'm doing, including the constructors that I'm creating. These are all things that, unfortunately, I have to look at. I have to both create them and I have to look at them. And they could be done a different way. I'm not going to do it today, but there's two options I could offer to you to achieve the same thing I'm doing right now without doing what I'm doing right now. One option is good for anyone who's on a modern version of Java, and that is to use Java records. Java records, essentially, at the end of the day, Java records are what you, if I were to do this as a Java record, a book that is, it would look a lot like what you see here as far as its functionality, but the code would only just be a few lines. And Java records are nice for that. They're great when all you're doing is have something that's carrying data around. And what you get out of them is whatever properties you declare, and essentially a constructor that takes those arguments. And I have no problem with using Java records. I like them just fine. One place, however, where they will not work is if you're doing JPA persistence. So if you're persisting your data through JPA, JPA demands that you have a default constructor, whereas Java records, by definition, will never have a default constructor. So you can't use Java records with JPA. I mean, you can as some sort of data transfer object, but you can't use them as the actual entity that's going to be persisted. You just can't. So I could have, but I'm not going to use JPA. I'm going to use something else. And so I could have used Java record here. So I did, but I just chose not to. The other option I could have had is to use Lombok. And I'm a big fan of Lombok, but I choose not to do that from time to time, especially when I'm giving a presentation, for a lot of reasons. I won't go into the details of it. Suffice it to say that Eclipse and my Mac M1 and Lombok, when they all get in the same room, they start messing with me. So it works fine for a little while, and then right during a presentation where everybody's watching me, something goes weird. On my Intel machine, never a problem, but on my Mac M1, all the time. Like, as soon as somebody's watching me, they stop getting along. So I don't know why that is, but that's why I'm choosing not to use Lombok. Otherwise, I love it. And that is like a unscripted, that's the unscripted tip I'm giving you, is if you don't know anything about Lombok, go check it out. It's actually a very, very nice way of avoiding all this boilerplate code. But I'm going to go now, and I'm just going to annotate this with, come on, where's it at? Oh, you know what? I can't annotate it with what I want because I forgot to go add a dependency. So I'm going to come over here and add a dependency. And specifically, the one I'm going to add is Spring Data JDBC. Now, Spring Data has lots of different modules. JDBC is just one of them. I could use JPA, Neo4j, Mongo, Redis, Cassandra, the Couchbase, list goes on. I'm going to stick with JDBC for now. So Spring Data JDBC. I'm going to go ahead and add that dependency. There it is. And now I should be able to resolve my ID. So there we go. Notice I annotated ID with org Spring Framework data annotation ID. This is the same annotation you would use regardless of which Spring Data project you're using, with one exception, and that is Spring Data JPA, because JPA has its own @ID annotation, and you would use that in the case of JPA. But otherwise, we're good here. Let's go add our repository. I call it book repository. It is going to extend CRUD repository. CRUD repository comes from Spring Data, and it wants to be parameterized with the type of thing we're persisting and the type of that thing's ID. So in this case, our ID is long, the type we're persisting is book, and we're good to go. And CRUD repository gives, among other things, it gives about a dozen or so CRUD operations, just for, create, delete, or save, delete, find by ID. And so we're going to get those out of the box. Of course, we're going to need an implementation for it, but we'll come back to that. We'll deal with that in a minute. And there's only one, there's one other thing I need to do regarding persistence, and that is I do need to define my schema. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm sort of doing the lazy way out, and I'm creating a schema.sql file. It works. It'll do what I need it to do. But I don't recommend necessarily that this is what you would do in any sort of real world application. Instead, I would recommend that you look at something like Flyway or Liquibase. These are going to help you both not only maintain your schema, but also, essentially version your schema and roll it back and, deal with data migrations and things like that. And it's going to do that really nicely for you. Whereas what I'm doing right here is sort of just a lazy way of creating a schema. So I'm going to have an ID of entity. I'm going to have an ISBN of varchar 10, not null. It's going to have a title varchar 100, not null, and an author varchar 100, not null. You can tell I've given a great deal of thought to the length of these things. And so I just picked 10 because I know that ISBNs are typically 10. And I just thought, well, people's names and titles, those are probably longer than 10. So I just added another 0. All right, with that said, I have my repository. I have my domain entity. I just need something to exercise this. So I'm just going to go quickly and create a controller. So books controller. It's going to be a REST controller. It's going to have a class level request mapping saying that no matter what everything else in this controller does, or what kind of requests they handle, those requests are going to be handled with a root path of /books. So we're going to handle a GET request for /books by returning an iterable of type book. And we're going to do that by something. I got to deal with that. That's not what I meant to do. Sorry about that. We're going to do that somehow, but the somehow I have to deal with. I need to say, all right, books controller, book repository, repo. We're going to assign that to that field. Okay, that's what I wanted to do. And then we're going to say repo.findAll and return that. All right, so far so good. I'm going to stop this. I just added a dependency, and I can talk about this in a minute, but the thing is, if I add a new dependency or change a dependency, DevTools notices that, but it doesn't pick it up. So There's reasons for that. I'm just going to stop the app until I get everything settled. Otherwise, it's going to keep giving me errors in the console. I'm going to add another method. So get mapping, where the path is /ID. I'm going to give it a, what I'm going to look for here. I think I'm going to just do an optional type book. The method name doesn't matter, but I'm going to call it find by ID. So path variable, ID, long ID, and well, that didn't help me, did it? Return repo dot find by ID, passing in the ID. And finally, one other method, because we are going to need a way to get some data in there. A post request is going to return a book, save, we'll call it save. It doesn't really matter what the method name is, but I want to get the contents of the request body, the post request body, bind it to book, and save that book. Great. Have all the parts in place. I don't think I've missed anything. Let's go ahead and run it. Oh yes, I did forget something. I do need a database. So I'm going to come back over here and add H2 as my database. Now this, what I'm doing will work with pretty much any relational database, but I'm picking H2 because it's nice, good embedded database that works for demos such as this. Cool, it should be added. Let's try starting it again. There we go. Let's pull my window back over, or did I just hide it? There it is. Pull the window back in, and I'm going to say curl localhost 8080/books, and I got an empty array back. Now let's talk about this a minute, because it is an embedded database. I've never populated it with any data, so it's not surprising that I don't have any data. The surprising bit, if you've never seen this before, might be that my repository does not have an implementation, and yet it didn't complain. Well, let's go a little bit further before we talk about that anymore. And I'm going to go create a book. In fact, I'm going to use a different tool to create a book than curl. I could do this with curl, but it's kind of a pain to do with curl. I'm using another tool called HTTP IE, which is like curl for sane people. First off, it defaults to localhost, and so I don't have to tell it that. It also assumes JSON, and it even knows how to take things like parameters and turn them into JSON. So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to give it an author of Kendall Crolius, and the title is, are you ready for this? You're going to want to write this one down. Knitting with Dog Hair. There we go. We just added a book. Let's add another book. And this book will be similarly titled Crafting with Cat Hair by Kaori Sutaya. And now when I go ask for books, there they are. If I do this with HTTP IE, it formats it a little bit nicer for me. There they are. And now I can even go ask for a book by its ID. There's the one for knitting with dog hair. Here is the one for crafting with cat hair. And in case anybody's snickering, because usually when I do mention these books, everybody kind of laughs a little bit. Those are real books. I kid you not. Now the ISBNs I made up because I never can remember ISBNs, but those are real books. I actually own them. I have them around here somewhere. I think I left them in my backpack, but yeah, they are actual real books, and they're just so much fun and funny that I use them as my example. But I've never actually used them to create, a sweater or anything from my dog's hair, even though she does shed her own weight in hair every day. I could easily keep the entire world warm with whatever I could get from her. But whatever, real books. So that said, the tip I'm going for here is, if you've never seen Spring Data before, this is what Spring Data does for you. At startup time, Spring Data is going to see that you have a repository, you have an interface that extends, not CRUD repository, that's not as important as the fact that it extends repository, which is a marker interface. When Spring Data sees that there's an interface that extends either directly or indirectly repository, it is going to automatically on the fly as the application starts up, it is going to create an implementation for you. And it's going to give you an implementation of all those CRUD methods. But what it also does is this is even where it gets better. Let's go back to our controller and let's have a look at, actually, I want to show you two things. One of them is a really bad idea, and then the other one is better. I'll show you the bad idea first. I think this works. Before I show it to you, I'm going to give it a kind of a warning that I may be remembering wrong, that it's part of Spring Data by itself. I may have to add another library in to make it work. If it doesn't work, I'm not going to worry. I'll tell you what that library would be, and then we'll move on and not worry about it. But I want to at least try it right now. Instead of taking the ID as a long, what if we just took the ID as a book? And then what if instead of actually bothering to go to the repo, we just returned the book? And since I'm returning an optional, I might as well say optional of book. Now let's just see if that works. I do, in my mind, I'm wondering if I'm remembering this right. Well, obviously I'm not remembering something right, because yeah, ID of book is present with the converter. Yeah, what that's basically saying is I remembered wrong. And I did warn you, I might have remembered wrong. Actually, I don't think that's what I'm trying to do here is a feature of Spring Data. It's a feature of Spring Data REST. There is another project under Spring Data that does a lot of things, but one of those things is if I have a parameter that references the ID, it will actually go resolve the actual object for you before the request is called. And so it'll just hand you the object, which is actually super nice when you think about it. But yeah, I was starting to wonder if that was part of Spring Data proper or Spring Data REST. So now I remember, and everybody else has learned from it as well. But let's not worry about that. Let's put it back the way it was. And let's talk about what's wrong with what I just did. Well, first off, I don't have any data in there, so I'm going to have to go get my data back in there, because this is an in-memory database, and every time the app starts, it loses everything. But if I were to go ask for this book by its ID, we have two problems here, and they're both the same. One is that I had to ask for that by its ID. Now, I don't like the idea of exposing database-specific IDs through my API, especially when you're querying for them. I mean, showing them the results, that's a little concerning, but requiring the client to be aware of those IDs, that bothers me a bit. And sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes it's, even if it's not necessary, it's acceptable. But generally speaking, I don't like the idea of having database specific IDs in my API. Instead, I would rather use a natural, if possible, a natural ID, or if it's some assigned ID, then at least have it a system assigned ID and not a database assigned ID. Because the problem with database assigned IDs is if this were to be deleted and then re-added, it's going to show up again with the different ID, and it's going to potentially break a client who's expecting it to have been ID of 2. I've actually seen situations where that happens. So I like to avoid that if I can. So instead of asking for it by its ID, what if we were to say, I want to ask for it by its ISBN? So I'm going to make a couple small changes here. The method name doesn't matter. I could have left it alone, but I'm just trying to be consistent. So I am going to change the names where appropriate. And I'm going to change this to ISBN. And then finally, I'm going to change that to ISBN. Of course, I don't have such a method. CRUD repository doesn't expose a find by ISBN method because CRUD repository doesn't know about books, doesn't know about that particular domain. So instead, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add in here an optional book find by. Notice I get some code completion help here in the IDE. It's wanting find by ISBN, and then the IDE, as much as it tried to help me, actually did something dumb. So let me clean up its mess. Okay. So there we go. Now I have just added find by ISBN, which makes my books controller happy. It's able to call something now. Now I need to get my data back in there, because again, I lost it when the application restarted. But now if I go ask for a book by its ID, I get nothing. If I ask for it by its ISBN, then we're getting some data back. And it's just as simple as that. by adding a new method to my repository and following a fairly well-defined naming convention on my method, I'm able to tell it to find books. And we know we're talking about books because that's what the CRUD repository is parameterized with. We're going to go find books by what? By their ISBN property. Works really great. Now, let's talk about that ID that we left in here. That one right there. I don't like that there either. How can we get rid of that? Well, there's a lot of different ways we could do it. There's some JSON stuff you can do with this to kind of filter that stuff out and leave these properties out. But another way you can do it that's worth noting, and the reason I'm showing you this way is because it's more than just a matter of leaving fields out. It's also a matter of being able to kind of customize an object from the database without, is sort of like providing a DTO, providing a carrier for data and not letting it be the same data that actually came out of the database, but something that you could even modify with some custom fields and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go create my custom object, my custom thing that's going to represent a book that does not have the ID in it. And I'm going to call it simple book. And you notice it's an interface. And that may seem weird to you, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. We'll deal with that in a minute. Get ISBN, get title, and I'm not even going to bother putting author in there because maybe I don't even want the author in there. I just want the ISBN and the title. Those are the two things I'm going to have. Then over in my repository, I'm going to keep this method laying around just for history's sake. I may choose to delete it some other day, but for now I'm going to leave it in there, and I'm just going to have it have another method like it that returns simple book. Now, it's important to understand with Spring Data, anything between find and buy, with a couple of exceptions, anything between find and buy is ignored. So by giving the word simple in here, I've been able to, it's going to be ignored, but it enables me to get past the fact that if I didn't do that, these two method names would collide. Java would get mad at me for that. And then to try this out, let's go over to my controller, and I'm going to keep this laying around just like I did the other one, but I'm going to give it another handler method very much like it. That is going to return a simple book instead of a book. And the way I'm going to differentiate these two get mappings is I'm going to say this. I'm going to say path equal, and I'm going to say request params. Oops, I'm sorry, params. I sometimes get that confused with something else. Params equal simple. Okay, let's let that restart. And I'm going to show after I get my data back in. First off, I think I may have jumped the gun on adding the data. Let's make sure that they both got in there. Yes, they did. Okay, we're good. And let's go look for the book by Kendall Crolius, the Knitting with Dog Hair book. And it worked. This is not the simple version though. This is the one that is still pulling back the author and the ID in addition to the ISBN and title. But if I did this, and I need to put quotes around it because question mark means something special to the shell, then I get back just the ISBN and the title. Well, that's kind of awesome because when you think about it, simple book's just an interface. There's nothing special about it at all. It's just an interface. And what's more is book doesn't even implement simple book. Where's the connection here? And there really isn't much of a connection between the two. Book repository deals with books, and I'm asking it to return a simple book. That's the connection. That's really the only connection, except for perhaps you could argue that the other connection is that simple book has some getters that are the same as what's in book, but that's really it. And it just automatically figures it out. Before I stop and pause and see if there's any questions, I'm going to go ahead and show you one other thing though. Let's get the author in there, but I don't want the author in there the way I've done it. I don't want to simply say, I mean, I could do this. I could say get author, do that and call it good. That would work and it would get the author's name in there, but I'm going to do something different. I'm going to actually modify the data as it comes out through simple book. And instead I'm going to add get author first name, and then get author last name. Now that's not going to work. I'm going to hit save, and you're going to see that when it restarts and I try to make that request, well, I got to get some data in there first, otherwise it won't matter. When I make that request, I'm going to get an error. And the reason for that error is it doesn't understand what author first name and author last name is, but I can help it with that. And what I'm about to do, I recognize fully is not, it's kind of a naive way of dealing with it. Because, you know, it works with Kaori Sutaya, it works with Kendall Crolius, it works with Craig Walls, it works with most people, but it doesn't work with everybody, where the first word in the name is their first name and the second word is their last name. I recognize that, but for demos purposes, we're just going to pretend that's okay. So I'm going to say, using this expression, I'm going to say target dot author dot split. I'm going to split it on the space. Give me the 0th element from that split. I'm going to do the same thing for the last name, except I don't want the 0th one. I want the first one. All right, let's get some data in there again. Let's do that. And then now we have our author's first name, last name, ISBN, and title in there. Isn't that a fantastic opportunity to stop and see if there's any more questions? I do see somebody agreed with me on Lombok. That's also awesome. Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat. So anyone want to chime in? Otherwise, I'll keep moving. All right, then. So I'm going to show you one other quick thing, and mostly because it's annoying me if I don't. But the fact that I have to keep, every time the application restarts, I have to go keep adding my data back in, that's getting old. I'm tired of that. And so I'm going to show you something that you can use for a lot of different purposes. I'm going to use it to get my data preloaded in there before the app starts. But you can use this technique for so many different things. And I'm going to create a bean. I'm going to declare a bean method of type application runner. Now, application runner has a sibling type called command line runner. They do exactly the same thing. The only difference is they take different types of arguments when they're doing it, and you get to choose which one you want. In my case, I'm not going to use the arguments anyway. I'm going to completely ignore them. And so it doesn't really matter that much. But what an application runner and a command line runner do is when the application starts up, if there's any beans of type application runner or command line runner, then they have a run method, which I'm implementing as a Lambda here. They have a run method that will get executed, and you can have it do whatever you want. Any sort of initialization or any sort of startup logic you need to put, you can put inside of here. And so I'm going to say repo.save new book, and it's going to have 3 things in it. And I know I'm going to have 2 books that I'm going to work with. So I'll copy that. And I'm going to say 1111 and 22222, knitting with dog hair by Kendall Crolius. And then the other one, crafting with cat hair by Kaori Sutaya. There we go. Now I just hit save. So it did in fact restart, but I can still do this. It's still going to work because now the data has been loaded for me by the application runner. It's just a tiny little trick, but it is worth sharing with you for no other reason than I don't have to keep adding this stuff in from now on. But now I want to show you this. I want to talk to you about configuration properties. And there's this file here called application properties. And this is one of many places where you can configure the properties for your application. For example, if I wanted to start, everything's been starting on port 8080, but I can also tell it to start on port 9090. And when I hit save, it's going to restart. And you're going to see, if you squint really hard, you can see down here on the bottom left in my Spring Boot dashboard, everything restarted on port 9090. In fact, you can see right here, Tomcat is started on port 9090. That is a configuration property that I did to do that. Now, if I'm using an H2 database, but if I wanted to, and I'm not going to follow through on this because I don't have another database laying around to do this, but if you wanted to, and chances are you do want to in a real application, if you wanted to refer to another database, you can say things like spring.datasource.url. Come on, where is it at? Where are my spring.data source dot. It's bound to be one of these. And that, I always forget these all these properties and what they really are, because it's really interesting that it doesn't offer me what I was looking for. It offers me, yeah. Well, regardless, I can set different properties for my data source, and these are great. You can do these, but ultimately, what's happening is no matter what property I'm setting here, these are being set on some bean in the application context, some component that Spring has auto configured for me in the application context. If I want to set logging, I can say logging.level, and then I can say .org.spring framework.web equal debug. I can do that. Now I've turned on debugging for Spring MVC. I'm not going to keep that because it's really annoying. But again, setting configuration properties in an application properties file like this does ultimately sets those properties on some component, and then that component uses those to decide how it's going to behave and what it's going to do. Now, one of the things about properties files is, at least for me, maybe you disagree, but for me, once you have 2 or 3 properties in there, it starts getting a little unwieldy. And once you have a dozen or so properties, I don't even want to look at it anymore. It's just hard to read. So one of the first things I usually do is I convert my properties to application.yaml. And YAML files, I mean, this is a very simple YAML file, but YAML files are really nice in that they sort of enforce a certain structure on you. It's not that bad, but at least that structure makes it easier for you to find properties, makes it easier for you to read. So I usually switch to YAML. Now, I don't care if you like YAML or not. That's not the point. The point is I have at least now 2 ways of setting properties, application.properties and application.yaml. And there's going to be more. I'll show you a few more here in a moment. But for now, just because I don't want to look at it, I'm going to take that property out. And we're going to come back and add some other properties in a minute. I don't want to have to deal with port 9090. That's going to confuse me. And I'm going to keep trying to go to 8080 and it's not going to work. So I'm just going to get rid of it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here. I'm going to do something that I should have done at the beginning of the talk. And the reason I should have done this is because, if I'm not mistaken, I am required by law in 48 of the 50 states and Puerto Rico to have a hello world example. So here we go. Here's my controller. I'm just going to say get mapping. Going to handle requests for hello. And it's going to do something just as simple as returning the words hello in eject. That's what we're going to say. All right. I guess I should return. I've been doing some coding in other languages don't require the return keyword, and sometimes I forget to actually type it. But now it's restarted. I should be able to say, instead of books, I can say port 8080/hello. And look, there it is, hello in ejug. Fantastic, but that's been hard coded now. So how can I get rid of that hard coding? How can I extract that out? Well, let's take some baby steps. Let's start by creating a string called message. And we'll set that to hello in eject. I mean, this really doesn't solve our problem. All we've done is we've moved the problem out of the method. It's at least not hard coded in the method, but we still have a problem here. Let's make sure it still works, and it does. Cool. Now we can do this. We can toss on here at value. You may remember at value from my simple book. It works here as well. I'm going to say at value, but instead of saying hash curly brace, I'm going to say $ curly brace. And I'm going to give it a name, a property name, a greeting.message. Now, when I do this, it's going to give me an error. And the reason it's going to give me an error is because when the application started, it says there's no such property. The property greeting.message does not exist. Now, I'm going to go set greeting.message, but what if in a production setting, somebody forgets to set that? Well, you can also set a default. So I'm going to say hello in ejug, and then I can get rid of this. Now let's see what happens. All right, I've done that. And it works. We're back in business. It's now saying hello in ejug again. And if I were to come over here to my application properties file and say, or application YAML file, say greeting message, And then next week, I'm going to be in Minneapolis. I say, hello, MSP. I'm not going to type in Minneapolis in front of everybody. That's going to be a disaster if I try that. So I'm going to use their airport code. Hello, MSP. And I guess, what did I not change? It should have restarted by now, and I don't think it did. So greeting message. That's, I'm a little confused now. Why is it doing that? It's as if that property is not being set, except, oh, you know what? Well, no, that's not it. I got to be honest, I'm a little bit confused, but I'm not going to worry myself with it because that's not what I wanted to show you anyway. That was just a step toward what I want to show you. Instead, what I would like to do is create another class, and we're going to call this greeting props. And in greeting props, I have to remember first, I need to make it a component so that Spring will, using component scanning, Spring will pick it up and add it to the Spring application context. That's important. And then I'm going to give it a property of type message, and I'm going to give it all the getters and setters necessary for that. And again, Lombok could have helped me with this, or I could even, I guess I could have done a record on this case as well, but I'm just going to leave it be. We have greeting props, and there's only one other thing I need to do. I need to annotate it with configuration properties, prefix, greeting. So think about what we're looking at here. Greeting, message. We have greeting and we have message. That's greeting.message. The prefix is greeting. The actual property name is message. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to add in hello controller. It's going to take my greeting props. It's going to assign that to a new field. And then down here, instead of returning message, I'm going to say props.getMessage. All right, now let's see what happens. I'm also going to get rid of that import that I didn't need. And now it says, well, I won't lie to you. I'm terribly confused right now. And now I'm starting to wonder if I made a typo at some point in my name or something, because greeting message, that should work. Application.yaml, that is so odd. I know for a fact this worked for me yesterday because I did this exact same example yesterday. Tell you what I'm going to do. I am going to pretend that this never happened, and I'm going to start over creating that one file, hoping that just by simply starting over, that whatever is causing the problem will just sort of just go away. So greeting, message, hello, MSP. I think I see stuff moving over here. No, I don't think the quotes were necessary because it's in a YAML file. I'm pretty sure that wasn't necessary. I mean, we could always.
I think it wants you to spell Minneapolis.
Huh? I'm sorry.
I think it wants you to spell Minneapolis. Sorry.
No, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, I gotta say, I'm terribly confused right now. Let's do a hard restart. Let's just see if maybe something is just.
There's a warning on the right side bar. So the yellow spot.
The warning I'm expecting. That one I expect, but I still expected it to work. And the reason it's complaining about that is because the IDE doesn't know what that property is. There's ways around that. Oh, I see an error down here. I'm starting to wonder if something just hasn't been rebuilt since at all, even though I'm making changes, if it just hasn't even being rebuilt. And that could be it. All right, I'm gonna do one other thing, and then I'm just gonna throw my hands in the air and scream a little bit. It's odd. That is so odd. I know I did this yesterday. Well, about that warning though, since you did mention the warning, there is a way to get rid of that. We'll come over to our POM file. We're gonna say, and of course, no guarantees that this is going to do what I want it to do now that all bets are off with regard to just simply saying greeting.message. But I'm going to add in a Spring configuration processor. Now, there's a couple of things you can do here. I'm going to add all of these. I don't know if it matters. In fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't, but I'm just going to make sure that I don't miss something. You can actually go create your own metadata for these properties, or you can let Spring Configuration Processor do it for you. And when you do, let's see, where am I at? Well, now my IDE has decided to get busy doing something. All right, so remember I told you at the beginning, when I first opened up my IDE, that sometimes I have to kill my IDE for no good reason, because when people are watching me, now is one of those times. Apparently, I recognize this. It gets up to updating Maven project, it gets up to 75%, and then it stays there forever. And I thought it was just my machine. But during a workshop on Tuesday, somebody in my workshop experienced the exact same thing. And oddly enough, at the exact same times I was experiencing it. It was the weirdest thing. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a really weird quirk in Maven or in Eclipse that causes this to happen. But I wouldn't expect it to have happened to two people at the same time. So I'm going to have to ask your forgiveness while I go clean this up, and I'll restart the ID, and hopefully it'll go away. It didn't do it at all yesterday, by the way. I did, 12, 13 hours worth of sessions yesterday, and not once did it happen, but now it's happening again. What am I asking for? PS minus A. Oh, I'm sorry, PS minus X, Java. And actually, you know what? I'm going to do this Spring tool. That's what I really want. So I apologize for this little hiccup. I don't know why it's happening. It is something that I will admit to you is prompting me to consider, it's prompting me to consider switching IDEs, even though I love Spring Tool Suite. I'm starting to lose that love lately because of some of this. I might start, that doesn't mean I won't use Spring Tool Suite. Spring Tool Suite is a set of extensions that can also be plugged into VS Code. So that's maybe where I go. I have a full license for IntelliJ, so I could do that. Certainly, that's an option for me. I'm not sure if that's what I want to do either. Mostly it's not because I don't like IntelliJ, it's just because old dog, new tricks. I'm not sure I can make myself use it. Okay, we're good. Maybe we start it up and maybe it won't bother me again, at least for the next few minutes. All right. Let's try again. I have no level of confidence right now, but looky there, it works. Isn't that amazing? All you have to do is restart the IDE. I'm not sure why that happened. I honestly don't, but now we're back on track and it's doing what I wanted it to do. Great. Now, let's talk about what if happens if, I'm going to Minneapolis next week. I'm talking to you folks in Boston this week. What if I were to go to, well, actually my next stop that I'm aware of is in fact Boston again. What if I wanted to put BOS for Boston Logan on there? Well, I don't want to necessarily have to rename or recompile every time I change application.yaml. So what can I do? Let's see what we can do. I am going to change this to something as simple as hello world. Then I'm going to come down here and say -- Spring profile, and we're going to put in there BOS. And I'm going to say greeting message for the Boston profile will be Boston. And then for Minneapolis, MSP will be, okay, I'll try it one time. There we go. I'm really surprised I managed to pull that off. All right, so now let's try it again. It says hello Minneapolis, and that is the surprising part. Oh, I know why. I think that's supposed to be Spring profiles. There we go. There we go. So the default profile, which means there's no profile set, is going to be hello world. And that's what we got right there. But in a production application where I'm ready to go to Minneapolis, I might come over here and set an environment variable. Now I'm setting the environment variable in my IDE because that's where I am actually running things at. But I say Spring profiles active, and I set it to MSP. I apply it. Now, because I changed an environment variable, that doesn't trigger Spring Boot DevTools to restart. So I do have to do a hard restart. And as soon as I do that hard restart, I get a brand new set of logging. And if you come to the start of the logs, you can see this line here that says the following one profile is active, MSP. So already it's promising that this is going to work. And I ask again and I get Minneapolis. And if I were to go change that to BOS, it would be Boston. And I could do that. I could change these different profiles all I want. Now, where does this stuff come from? How does it even know what to look at? Well, I'm going to stop the app while I go add, because I'm about to add a dependency. I'm going to go add a dependency on the actuator. Now, I don't have the time to show all the cool things that the actuator does. In fact, I have given in the past entire 1.5-hour sessions on nothing but the actuator. And there for a while, I was giving 2 1.5-hour sessions on the actuator and still didn't get it all in there. I'm going to focus on one very specific thing about the actuator. It's really weird that I have a properties file and a YAML file right now. I don't know where that came from, but I'm not going to worry myself with it. I'm going to go up here and add another property in my default profile. I'm going to add a property called management.web. This is actually not the full name. The full name is management.endpoints web exposure include. The thing about that is I never can remember that. So good thing the IDE can, otherwise I'd never get this done. All right, so there we go. I'm going to let that do its thing. It is apparently doing that same Maven, updating Maven stuck thing again. And I apologize. I'm going to get through this really as quickly as I can so I can show you this again. And I'm going to spend the next month trying to figure out how to use another IDE. I don't know why it does this when people are watching. I'm starting to believe it has something to do with Zoom. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I probably not, but I can blame Zoom. That's what I'm going to do. And I don't think anybody can argue with me that it's not Zoom. So, because every time it does happen, it's happening when I'm using Zoom. Probably just a coincidence. Hope nobody here works for Zoom. Otherwise, I've just offended somebody. Okay, let's just see. Do I still have Java running? Oops. All right. Hopefully when it comes back, we're going to be back in business. Let's try it one more time. So starting up, I'm going to make sure it works. That's the main thing I want to do, is make sure it didn't break. And now I am going to find my browser. I'm going to pull it over here. I'm going to say localhost 8080/actuator/env. And of course, there's a 404. Why? Why is that? At least 2 theories, no? You know what? It didn't pick up my change. That's why. When that last thing I did right before everything crapped out, it didn't pick it up. I'm going to delete this properties file because that's bothering me. I don't think it's causing me any problem other than the fact that it shouldn't be there. Yeah, I didn't pick up that change when I hit save. So management.web.exposure include, and I'm going to cheat a little and just enable everything. Hopefully it won't freeze up on me again. So again, the actuator does a whole bunch of things. Among them is this endpoint right here that I wanted to show you. These are where the properties come from. First off, it's going to tell you what the active profiles are. The MSP is the active one. The properties, well, the server ports, that's a property source that is made up. Boot makes it up to kind of communicate to the application context, what port it's currently running on. Now, the property called server.port, that also knows at least what property you set it to, but that may be different than what it's actually running on. For example, if you set server.port to 0, it's going to pick a random high number port, and Server.port will be 0, but local server port will be the actual port that was chosen. So that's why there's this special one. You can't set anything in this source. It's sort of just a byproduct of setting server.port. You have command line arguments. You could always, if you're running this to the command line, do it from there. You can set servlet context and init params, which is really unusual to do that, but it's an option. System properties, JVM system properties. When you're running this from the command line, if you build this into a jar file and you say java-jar, whatever it is, you can say -d and give it whatever system properties you are. And you can set these things. Down here, you have the environment variables. And in fact, you see one right there that I did set. I did set Spring Profiles Active to MSP. And so that's the environment variable that got picked up. And then if we keep on going, we have right here, application.yaml, document 2. That's kind of important. If you come over here and look at the application.yaml file, these triple dashes break up the documents. This is document 0. This is document 1. This is document 2, the MSP one. So we're talking about the one where the profile is MSP and whose greeting is Hello Minneapolis. That's where it's getting the greeting message from. But we also have configuration from document 0, which includes, among other things, the fact that I enabled all these actuator endpoints, but also it also knows the default greeting message. So these properties can come from multiple places. In fact, if you're really wondering where did greeting.message come from and you don't want to have to dig around through here like I just did, you can just ask for it right here. And you can see all of the property sources without any properties in them, except for the places where greeting.message is. Those will be highlighted. And you see that it came from document 2, which is application.yaml, line 22, the value started at column 12. Likewise, this one was in document 0, line 2, the value started at line 12, or I'm sorry, column 12. Well, with that said, I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing I'm running short on time. I have about 100 other things I could show you, or at least 50 that I spoke of. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do I'm going to try doing 2 rather small things. I'm not going to follow through all the way on one of them because it'll take longer than I have, but I just want to show you one thing that's really, really cool that Spring can do. And to do that, I need to come over here to the directory that the project's in. And the best way to find that is to ask the IDE, where did it create it? And I'm just going to build my project. So I'm going to say Maven W package. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to create my executable jar file. It's going to take a second while it creates it. It's going to run a test. You're going to see ASCII art go by while it runs that test. And then pretty soon it is going to have, I'm going to go ahead and stop that. It is going to have a jar file in the target directory that I can say .java-jar target, and then it's going to be any jug demo, and I can run my code that way. Now, you may have seen this as a Spring developer. If you've worked with Spring Boot at all, you've probably seen this. Another way of doing it though, is I can say Maven W spring-boot run. And what that's going to do is just run it directly, not create it into a jar file and then force me to say java-jar, but it's just going to run it. But as a Spring Boot, if you've worked with Spring Boot before, maybe you've seen that too. But here's another way. Maven W spring-boot build image. And what that's going to do, it's going to take longer, and it's also, I'm not going to be able to necessarily show it to you running, but if it's going to build an image, and it's going to put it into Docker, and I can run it from Docker, or I could push it out to Docker Hub or some image repository, and I could pick it up and deploy it in Kubernetes. If I had a YAML file, a manifest file to deploy in Kubernetes, I could do that. But the idea is if you're at a point now where you're ready to start deploying image-based Spring, that's how you do it. Now I'm going to let this finish. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to have time to actually show you this running in Kubernetes. It's going to take a bit longer than I care to go into. But instead, what I'm going to do to wrap this thing up is perhaps the least useful thing I could possibly show you, but the most fun by far. And that is, I've got this image over here. I'm going to take that image, I'm going to drag it under source main resources. I'm going to rename it. to banner.jpg. Okay. And I'm just going to kill that because I'm afraid that we're going to have some conflicts if it's running any tests on port 8080. So I'm going to go ahead and kill that. And then I'm going to start my application again. And I want you to notice that my ASCII art, which previously said something about spring, now has Mickey Mouse on it, because that image that I gave it was in fact just Mickey's kind of standing there. And by naming it banner.jpg, or it could be a banner.gif or banner.png, regardless, because it has the name banner, it picked it up and converted that image into ASCII art that is now part of my project. Now, I'm not saying you should do this. You could also create a banner.txt file and define whatever you want to in there, including maybe custom ASCII art that you picked up yourself or what have you. But the fact that you can do this is kind of cool. And in fact, a lot of times, even though I don't necessarily hand my projects an image and ask them to create my banner for me, I will create a banner.txt file with some custom ASCII art. And the reason that this is somewhat valuable is if you're working with microservices or you're working on multiple projects or whatever reason you have, sometimes you're looking at the log files and you're wondering, okay, which log files am I looking at? I've been looking at log files for the, all day long. Which projects log files am I looking at right now? Having a good ASCII art, not necessarily Mickey Mouse, but a good ASCII art in there that represents your project. Perhaps it has some sort of ASCII art version of your logo or something like that. That's going to help you get kind of hone in on what log files you're looking at. It's a simple trick, but it helps. Trust me, it does, because I have found myself doing that where I'm working with multiple projects and I simply don't know what log files I'm looking at. But having a good ASCII art in there will point it out to me. You don't have to do it as Mickey Mouse, though. In fact, I recommend that you don't. But it sure makes for a great demo if you ask me. So there you go. And with that, I'm going to call it.
Hey, Craig, there is one question you may want to answer.
Sure.
Oh, it's in the chat. I can read it out.
Yeah, I was just looking at it.
Yep.
There's actually a few questions. I'm going to kind of scroll up a little bit, make sure I'm not missing any. All right, I think I'm at this one. Is props in jar, can you change on the fly in production? Oh, yeah. The answer to that is yes and no. Can you change, basically, can you change properties in a running application without restarting the application? And the answer to that is there is a way. It's not a good way, but there is a way. And in fact, I've actually done or used a library that offers this. I've actually recreated what it does standalone, so I didn't have to have that library. Spring Cloud config server client comes with a bit of code that will, if you ask it to, restart or not restart your application, but pick up properties fresh. And it does it in a couple of different ways, but one of those ways is it exposes an actuator endpoint called refresh. And so you can do a post request to that endpoint and it will pick up any properties that have changed. The thing about that is, though, is that may not work. It's actually a little dangerous in some situations because it kind of relies on all of the components that you're configuring to be able to realize that there's new properties to pick up. And as an example of this, Hibernate won't necessarily pick up those properties. And you could get your system in a state where some of those components are aware that new properties are there and they'll pick them up and run with it. Other components won't be. And now your state's in an inconsistent, or your application's in an inconsistent state. I mention that only as a warning. I do know of projects who happily do this and get away with it all the time. But it can be done. I'll offer this too. You may or may not be deploying in a Kubernetes world, but if you are deploying your application as a image in Kubernetes, my recommendation is to not do that. Instead, what I would recommend is to somehow force your application to restart. To force Kubernetes to restart your application. And there's a few ways of doing that. The most basic way is a thing called a rolling restart. And the idea is that it gives a lot of people heartburn to think that something's going to restart their application, but the truth of the matter is this is very natural. This is a feature, not a bug, of Kubernetes, is that it will, if you have declared that you want 5 instances of your application and you ask for a rolling restart, Kubernetes is going to do a good job of popping up a brand new one, killing that one, popping up another one, killing that one, popping up another one. It's going to have, at any given point, you're never going to have less than 5. If you've asked for 5, you're never going to have less than 5. You might even have 6 for a brief moment while it's working through that restart. And it's, again, it's something that Kubernetes does really, really well. It does give people heartburn to think about that, but it's at some point you embrace it because it's one of those things that Kubernetes does. That's the best answer I can give you. Out of the box, no, Spring does not pick up new properties on the fly. You would have to restart the app to do that. But with a little bit of code you could write yourself, or using Spring Cloud Config Server's client, which will bring in that code, you can have an actuator endpoint that would force it to pick up new properties. It's just, you're playing with fire when you do. Let's see what I've got. Is Spring Boot good for web services, backend development, or web applications like traditional Spring and VC applications? I'm not sure I understand the question. When you say web services, I'm assuming you're not talking about SOAP, but you're talking about like REST APIs and things like
Yeah,
that.
the REST API. I mean, how does it compare with doing? Is it good just for backend REST API development, or you can have traditional HTML, JSP?
Oh, it's good for both of those things. It's just I don't talk as much about the HTML stuff as much as I used to, because not as many people are developing those kinds of apps. But absolutely, and the programming model is very similar to what you do for REST. The main thing you do differently is, let's go just pick on one of my controllers. Let's pick on Flaky controller because I can see it. If I were to turn Flaky controller into a HTML producing controller, I wouldn't annotate it with REST controller. I would just annotate it with controller. And then whenever it returns a value, there's a couple of ways of doing it, but the more common way of doing it is it would return not a modeled value. It would instead return a string that is the logical name of a view. And then you would populate a model. You would do something like this. You would basically have model passed into your controller, and then you would say something like model.add attribute, give it, something, some data, some value, and populate that all you want. And then instead of returning the words it worked, you would return flaky view, maybe something like that. And then depending on what view technology you're using, whether it's something like Timeleaf or FreeMarker or what have you, you would have a flaky view defined. So in the case of Timeleaf, which is my favorite, you would have over here under templates, you would create a file called flakyview.html, and that's what would render that data. So yeah, it can be used for REST APIs just as easily as it can for more traditional browser-based applications. In fact, long before Spring supported REST API, long ago, that was the main thing that Spring and VC did. And yeah, absolutely. It can also be used for things that aren't web at all. There's entirely a whole bunch of different types of applications, integration style situations, batch processing situations, where Spring can be used to create applications that don't even handle HTTP requests of any kind. And if you are handling HTTP requests, REST is only one option. There is another project out there called Spring GraphQL, and it'll help you create GraphQL APIs. In fact, I spoke on that yesterday. It's actually a really cool project to work with.
Thank you.
And any more questions? Oh, yes, I was waiting for somebody to ask this question because it comes up a lot nowadays. I hear there is a Java that will compile to fast images, not bytecode. Can that be done with Spring Boot? Actually, your question, the way it's worded anyway, sort of almost conflicts with itself. So I'm going to answer it the way I think you're wanting to ask. There is this thing called Graal VM. And what Graal VM does, it does a lot of different things. It can actually just be a standalone JVM. And it's apparently rather fast, although I've never used it in that format. What I have done, though, is Graal VM has a command that you can install called native image. And native image will build your application into a native executable for whatever platform you're compiling it for. And it is freaky fast. And a Spring application typically will start up in under a tenth of a second if you compile it with Graal VM, it's native image. But here's the gotcha. Graal itself doesn't like certain programming practices that are quite common in Java. Among those primarily is reflection. Grawl hates reflection, but that's okay. You can make it work. There are ways to configure Grawl during the compilation to just up front do some sort of pre-compile on it, so it sort of pre-assesses whatever reflection you're doing and creates code that sort of isn't reflection at runtime, but during compile time, it sort of translates reflective code into non-reflective code. And Grawl is really good at that, and you can configure Grawl to do that. The downside of it is configuring Grawl to do that is a pain, especially for a framework like Spring and Hibernate and things like that that have a lot of reflection in them. It can be a real pain. And so the Spring has a project called Spring Native, and what Spring Native does is essentially it still uses Grawl to do the builds, but Spring Native comes with all of that configuration to make Grawl happy. It comes with that out of the box. Now, of course, if your code, the code that you write, is doing something that Grawl doesn't like, that's still on you. We can't help you with that. But anything in the Spring framework or any of the libraries that Spring may be built on, Spring Native comes with the goodness to tell Grawl, hey, here's how you deal with that situation. It's wonderful. I've been using it a lot lately, in fact, and it's great. Now, the other gotcha with it is it's not fast. Once it's compiled and running, yes, your application will start up super fast, but the actual compilation step, not so fast. It takes a moment. And so it's not one of those things you want to just kind of build all the time during your development process. You want to go ahead and just do things the good old fashioned way with the JVM during your development process. And when you're ready to build for production, then yes, we can build a native image and you can deploy that however you want, and it'll start up super fast. Any auto-gen for sonar coverage? That's a really good question. And the answer to that is, I don't know. I just simply don't know the answer. Sorry. That is one thing I'll do for you. If I don't know the answer, I won't make anything up unless I give the preface of, well, I'm just going to speculate now. I don't know, but let's speculate. And in this case, I'm not even going to speculate. I just don't know the answer. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Craig. That was awesome. So this is like a month's worth of coding you did in a production, team, right? it takes months, Anyway, well, thanks everyone. I mean, we still have 23 people. That's a pretty good percentage, retention. So we had 35 at the max. So that is great. So yeah, we have the recording. We'll figure out what to do with it. Maybe put a link somewhere on the website or something like that. Thank you very much. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we look forward to the next month's meeting or presentation. So all right. So we welcome you all back here again.
Thank you.
With that, we'll wrap up. Thanks, Lori, for the meeting and everything. All right. Bye, guys. Good night.